minute. But what I wanted to do is just spend a couple of minutes as we start talking about my title. I don't know if it's up there. Lent and Surrender is what I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about. The basic concept of surrender, I think by and large we get. But in my context, and I don't know if it's the same here or not, it's the Lent bit that I think people struggle to connect with. What's the point? What's it for? Someone said to me at church the other week. Even for many of the Christians I meet, depending on their upbringing, Lent is still something, an anomaly, an unknown maybe, seen as little more than a window in the calendar year where they're expected to eat less chocolate. Somebody I was quizzing about this at church the other night said, I think I might put a pause on the pints. I thought that was a good way of describing it. Or maybe we think about partnering with a charity or putting extra money aside. I remember doing that as a child, parting with my hard-earned pocket money into a little Trocra box at the back of the church. Anyone else ever forced to part with their pocket money? I'm sure you did it with a much more grateful heart than mine. Other contexts, maybe some extra prayer meetings appear in the parish diary. Depending on the parish and the context, the vestments and altar coverings start turning a different colour. And for the uber keen churchgoers, opportunities to fast might even present themselves. Anyone an experience of fasting during Lent? A couple of hands. But it's I suppose this is, the research that I've been doing, the work I've been doing around this over the last couple of months is the underlying principle more often than not for Christians being this. Lent is about doing stuff. It's primarily about parting with things, giving something up or going without. Does that strike a chord? But I suppose one of the things I want to say tonight is that I just believe it's so much more than that. Maybe you could put the next slide up. And I don't know if this will translate, but I think the church needs what contemporary culture calls a do-over when it comes to Lent. I think we need a fresh look at things and to find a new approach. I can't obviously speak to all of this over the next 2 hours. But I've come with the seed of an idea for you, okay? The seed of an idea, which I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about, and then we can wrap up elsewhere when we get back to the gospel text. As we remember the life and way of Jesus together during Lent, it's not just a case of getting our facts straight in terms of the story, the passion, narratives, and getting our lives back in line. The gospel isn't an invitation into an anxious performative state where communion with God is secured by right behavior. Right? Humor the foreigner. Yes. Through the process, maybe this language is helpful, but through the process of finding our feet again in the story and person of Jesus this Lent, we come into contact with love. As we remember who Jesus is, think about his life and his ministry, his death, his resurrection, we come into contact with love. Not just in the general sense, but we come into contact with God's pursuit of us. Not just in the general sense, but of you and of me. So here's a question. What if we looked at Lent through the lens of love? What if we looked at Lent through the lens of love? And whatever else you take away from our time together this evening, let these words stay with you. You are the object of God's love. Maybe you're familiar with the Psalm 139, the psalmist. One of the things he's communicating, this idea, how precious are your thoughts about me? Wow. How precious are your thoughts about me? Is there anyone in the room that thinks they're outside of that? So it means that God has thoughts about you. You are the object of God's love. I want to suggest love is at the heart of Lent. Not hard work, but love. What if, instead of seeing this season in the life of the church as a time to get busy, show God how serious we are, what if instead of doing that, we quieten ourselves and our lives enough to become aware of God's loving and relentless pursuit of us? I don't know if you are an Apple Music fan or a Spotify fan. I wonder would we get a 50-50 down the room, but I'm listening to this amazing audiobook by the author Brennan Manning. I'm familiar with Brennan Manning, The Relentless Tenderness of Jesus. It's an amazing book if you're looking for something to read during Lent. That'd be a good book to try. But again, it's just this idea, the relentless tenderness of Jesus, the relentless pursuit. It's so funny, we tell these stories, we have these scriptures that we like. I imagine that if I started to quote from the 23rd Psalm, I won't do it because I don't want to put anyone under pressure. I imagine we would nearly get there, like the Lord's Prayer. We'd be able to say the whole thing. But how is it that it ends? Surely, your goodness and unfailing love will pursue, follow me just once, occasionally, if you do it well enough. Thank you, Simon. We got there together, bro. Surely the love of God will pursue me all the days of my life. What if we looked at Lent through the lens of love? Love is at the heart of Lent. And here's a question for us again. How could you make time for love this Lent and for being loved? Maybe it seems like a peculiar question. Write it down in the edge of your Bible or in your journal if you have one. I'm going to make a suggestion for how you might do that later on. So you have to stay to the end. Again, on the same front, the Apostle Paul, I think, so helpfully reminds us of this dynamic, the same dynamic, in his letter to the church in Ephesus, calling us God's workmanship, his masterpiece. The idea being that God is always present. Hello. That wasn't for dramatic effect. I think maybe I broke something. The idea being that God is always present to us, working in us, but we're not always present to him, are we? We get caught up in all kinds of distractions and pursuits and thoughts that draw us away from love. And Lent, in this very real sense, is fundamentally about honesty. It's about naming that drift from love before God and each other in community where we can, and with his help and leading, engaging in counter practices that help us to re-inhabit grace. Maybe if you go to the next slide, Eugene Peterson, if you're familiar with the author, Eugene Peterson, his paraphrase of this Ephesians text, the text I just mentioned, and he puts it this way: saving is all his idea, that is God's, and all his work. All we do is trust him enough to let him do it. It's God's gift from start to finish. We don't play the major role. If we did, we'd probably go around bragging that we'd done the whole thing. Just take a minute to reflect on the text on the screen. I just love those words and the orientation they describe for us. All we need do is to trust him enough to let him do it. We sang one of my favorite songs tonight. Thanks, guys. Waiting here for you. It has that kind of resonance and echo with the psalm that speaks, be still in the presence of God and wait patiently for him to act. Church, this spiritual life, is something God does. It doesn't mean that we don't have a role in it, but we need to be reminded. We need to trust him enough to let him do it. Trusting God to lead us in life, letting him work in us. Something I'm keen to unpack more in a minute, but before we do, I want us to press pause there. And you might be comfortable doing this, you'd rather run a mile. But if you're happy just to turn to your neighbor and take a look at these two questions and see if there's a conversation that might start. Take a minute to reflect and just to share with the person you're sat nearest to, what are your own experiences and expectations of Lent? Is it something that you just can't wait till pancakes are done next Tuesday and we get into Lent on Ash Wednesday? Or are you kind of going, you know what, I hadn't even realized it was happening. Wherever we are along that spectrum, just take a minute to talk about the first one, and then I'll prompt you to the second one in just a moment. So turn to your neighbor, have a quick chat, and we'll come back together in just a minute. So let's share as honest as we can. What is your experience of Lent? What are your expectations of Lent? Let's keep those conversations going. Okay, let's come back together. Any courageous souls brave enough to say something from where you're sat? What are your experiences of Lent? Loved it? Not sure? Good experiences? Bad experiences? Hit and miss? What's your... Thank you. Anyone else? Any other reflections or thoughts? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Thanks, Simon. Yeah. 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 Oh. Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections? So what about this next one then? What would it look like for you to quieten yourself and your life? I think sometimes we maybe like to jump to the life bit. We think, what could I do less of? But anyone ever tried to do any silent prayer or sit in quiet? And we find actually when we go to be quiet before God, we are everything but quiet. And we find ourselves scattered thinking about all kinds of things. Is it just us? Just Becky and I? What would it look like for you to quieten your life? Yes, but yourself, to become more aware of God's loving and relentless pursuit of us. What would that look like? Maybe a little harder to share with somebody, so maybe give yourself a minute to reflect before saying something, or maybe you know your answer straight away. Oh, I know for me, I know Netflix is my nemesis. Or these black little mirrors. I don't know if you've got one. No? Man, this thing it causes me to avoid all kinds of things. And we're praying about how we can renegotiate our relationship with technology this Lent, for sure. What does it look like for you? Have a think, and when you're ready, why don't you turn to the same person and just say, I think maybe I could try this, or maybe I could try that. How could we connect to love more? Feel free to chat when you're ready. Okay, let's come back together. I want to just say thank you for engaging with the questions and the conversations. It's so helpful, and I want to encourage you to keep a hold of that second question and be really thinking about what it might mean for you this coming Lent to become more aware of God's love for us, for you. And particularly, if you're happy to, I'd like to invite you to open up your Bibles again to the Gospel reading. Maybe you're more comfortable reading your Bible on your phone. I want you to turn to Mark chapter 10 again. I'm just going to spend a few minutes just unpacking some of the stuff that I prepared for you tonight. So this text, interestingly enough, has been quite central to our, I suppose, the conversation we're developing around apprenticeship and about spiritual formation in the life of our community in Dublin. This amazing text from Mark's Gospel. And to unpack it here tonight, there's two things I want to do. They're going to come up on the screen. So firstly, I want us to take a fresh look at the text itself. And then actually to help us, I think, bring a little bit more clarity to one of the aspects of the passage, we need to reference another passage. So I'm going to be actually leading us to reflect for a couple of moments on Song of Songs, chapter 5 also. So if you've got a Bible and you want to kind of keep Song of Songs 5 open as well. But let me jump into what I prepared to speak to you guys on. If you put the next slide up, that would be great. When Becky and I first started working on this text together to bring it to the church a few months ago, we realized that nearly every sermon, if not every sermon on this text, had focused exclusively on Jesus' words in verse 51. If you've got the text still there in front of you, it's this infamous question, isn't it? What do you want me to do for you? It's a great question. I think it's something that Jesus is always asking. But it's not what I want to share with you tonight. The longer we sat with the text as we worked on it together, another idea and theme started to emerge, which is the significance of Bartimaeus' cloak. We don't get a huge amount of information here in terms of who he was. Best case scenario, Bartimaeus' blindness simply disconnected him from his wider community. But worst case scenario, his blindness meant he had no one in his life at all. And seen through this lens, his cloak represents not just how he survived the solitary life of a sick person, but this was all he had. It was his whole way of life, which is what makes verse 50 so significant. What is it that the text tells us he does? He leaves it behind him. He throws it aside. His means of earning, his security blanket, he leaves it behind for this chance encounter with the man Jesus. It's amazing. Becky came up with this great line when we were working on the text together. Desire is uncovered, literally. This cloak he would have had around him is all of a sudden thrown off. And desire actually has a particular shape to it, a movement. Desire so strong that he's willing to leave his old ways of coping behind him to embrace the invitation of Jesus. Those are incredibly powerful words and ideas. Leaving our old ways of coping to follow after Jesus. This story is more than just a physical healing, and it is that. And as the church remembers Jesus, we want to acknowledge that. Jesus, the physician, the healer, the worker of miracles. What an incredible, incredible model for what human life looks like. It's also, however, about restored dignity, newfound community, and transformative discipleship. It challenges us to shed our own cloaks, to name our deepest desires, and to follow Jesus on the way. And this is where seeing Lent through the lens of love leads us, ultimately. And with that in mind, I wanted to mention the other passage that brings, I hope you'll agree, even greater clarity to this emerging conversation. Have you put the next slide up, please? In the work that we did preparing these talks for our community in Dublin, we found some surprising insight coming our way through the lens of Song of Songs 5. The unusual setting of these interesting poems from Song of Songs. Let me read a few of the verses for us. If you have them open, please feel free to follow along. The poet begins with these words: I slept, but my heart was awake. And when I heard my lover knocking and calling, open to me, my treasure, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of the night. But I responded, I have taken off my cloak. Should I get dressed again? I have washed my feet. Should I get them soiled? My lover tried to unlatch the door, and my heart thrilled within me. I jumped up to open the door for my love, and my hands dripped with perfume. My fingers dripped with lovely myrrh as I pulled back the bolt. Unusual language, different language. And whatever else we might think is going on here, whatever our experience of reading this text or these texts has been, recurring themes within the book of Song of Songs as a whole helps us to identify that this poet is painting a powerful picture for us. And the sequence goes something like this. God's people, in this case Israel, are asleep. And God has been absent, but now he has returned to awaken
and summon his beloved, his treasure. But I have taken off my cloak, the poet writes. Should I get dressed again? And these words seem to capture another kind of blindness altogether. Could it be that Mark is inviting us to reimagine who it is that is really blind in the gospel story? And as we look back to the Bartimaeus story from this vantage point, we see Jesus as the lover who has come to awaken the hearts of his people, yes, but more personally than that, as we reflect on it and immerse our times together in community around it, Jesus has come to invite each of us to follow him. What will our answer be? Writing about calling, the Jesuit priest Herbert Alfonso said this: I am not one in a crowd to God. I am not a serialized number or a catalogue card. I am unrepeatably unique, for God calls me by name. It's not this just generic tolerance of humanity, but the God who knew us before the creation of the world, the scriptures tell us. He knew us by name. He knew our very souls and personhood. The point of both Mark 10 and Song of Songs 5 is that love arrives at the door of each of our hearts and summons us into intimacy with God, which leads us to this question: is this what we want for our lives? Like Bartimaeus, do we want to be followers of Jesus on the way? Are we willing to shed our cloaks, pull back the bolt, like the poet says, to welcome him in to our lives? That picture of the bed of intimacy and of vulnerability. Bring Jesus into the things in our lives that nobody else knows about. Or would we rather just settle for survival? Imagine if Bartimaeus had done the same thing. And how disruptive, even in the social space, other people found his desire. Telling him to be quiet. Don't be bothering Jesus. Don't be pursuing him like this, so vulnerably. Now maybe you're sitting there thinking, that all sounds great, but how? What does it mean for me to open the door of my heart to Jesus? How do I quieten myself and my life enough this Lent to do this? Next slide, please. One suggestion we would like to offer is that you might think about using the spiritual practice of silent prayer this Lent. I'll talk about this more briefly later, but if you go to the very last slide, it should be a picture of a hand. Yeah, so this is like a screen grab of our website. And if you go to the resources page, the far right, there are some steps, more detailed steps on this practice of silent prayer that we're engaging with. Okay, you can go back to the other slide now with the steps on it. But you might find that helpful to go to the website and get more details. The spiritual practice of silent prayer. And think, when it comes to prayer, words, they help, of course. But more often than not, when it comes to the work of pulling back the bolt of love, to quote the text again, I have found myself in silence rather than in the throes of speech. It's not just the absence of sound. Silence is the soil in which a healthy prayer life can take root. And I want to encourage you to think about putting this into practice. Here's a version of what Becky and I do most days. And the thing with this is that it's just an example. You can tweak it, change it to find something else, or find something else that works better for you. Our encouragement is that you think about starting with 10 to 15 minutes a day maybe at the beginning of the day, the end of the day, sometimes both. And it simply is, if you go back a slide, please. Yeah, it's essentially, it starts with finding somewhere to be still. I don't know if you have the luxury of maybe having a space where you read your Bible and you pray that's not a room that isn't used for all kinds of other things. Or maybe it's a chair you love to sit in, or it's a place you love to go for a walk, or whatever the case may be. But Becky and I, often what we do is we find somewhere to be still and we light a candle and we begin to quieten ourselves. Sometimes, if you look at the 5 stages here, sometimes this is the thing that takes me the longest, because my head and my heart are all over the place. But my insistence upon this is of finding a place to be still and then settling in and quietening myself, and can take the longest. 2, checking in with yourself and with God. You might find it helpful to write some of these questions down. How am I feeling? Is there anything particularly on my mind, positive or negative? How would you describe yourself in this moment? I'm just really anxious about something that's happening at work at the moment. I'm really nervous about a conversation with a friend. They've asked to see me. I don't know what it's about. I'm really excited. I'm going to see a family member after dinner tonight. Whatever the thing is, it's about bringing all of who we are, our emotions, everything that's happening in our lives, into our times of prayer. Checking in with ourselves and God. How are we feeling? Number 3, in the quiet, allow a few minutes to imagine God looking on you with love. We kind of talked about this in broad terms earlier. But what does it mean for you to do that? Sometimes, I don't know if you're familiar with the Archbishop, ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. He talks about prayer in this lovely way. He talks about how you don't get a suntan by the way we get tanned. It has nothing to do with how we feel or how hard we try. It's about putting ourselves where the light can get us. It's a lovely picture of prayer. Putting ourselves where the love and the light of God can get at us. Imagining God looking on you with love. Sometimes it's helpful to imagine yourself on a park bench with your head back. And I know we haven't had a lot of sun recently, so it's a hard thing to imagine. But maybe you've been away in the sun and you know what it's like just to have the warmth of the sun on your face, and how lovely that is. I'm so looking forward to July and to my holidays. Allowing ourselves a few minutes to imagine God looking on us in love. And then step 4 is just lingering and listening. Sometimes we just blaze on past all these stages and we forget to stop and to listen. There's this Jesuit priest who's been teaching me to pray at the moment, and one of the stages he's been working with me has to do with what I long for, asking God what I long for, which is it's a related, but it's a slightly different question. And he always challenges me to think of it in a different way. What does God long for me? How do you think you'd answer that question tonight? What does the Father long for you? Sometimes we need to be still enough, quiet enough to hear what he's saying, to tell us what he longs for our lives, and maybe for our ministries too. And number 5, again, another Ignatian idea, talking honestly, bringing our real selves before a real God. So there isn't an element or a part of our lives that God isn't interested in. So we are encouraged to speak to God like we would to a friend, intimately, honestly, with integrity, not pretending that things are better than they are. Or maybe, as I am prone to do, it's a Canadianism that my wife has taught me, I like to throw a pity party. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Is anyone prone to the same thing? And sometimes I just feel sorry for myself before God. I was thinking, actually, well, what are the good things that are happening? And practicing gratitude. This takes some commitment. If you put the next slide up, it takes some commitment and intentionality. Speaking about silence, the author Martin Laird, quoting Luke chapter 5, says this: to navigate this ancient way of prayer is to put out into the deep and let down our nets for a catch. And I think what I love about that imagery of casting and recasting is that it's a very helpful idea, because in my experience of this practice is that when I go to be silent, I find that there is anything but silence in me, and I need to persist. And if this isn't a list of things that you must do in the however long that you've got, if you're doing 10 to 15 minutes, but maybe you don't get past step 1. Maybe you feel drawn to try to imagine the Father looking at you in love, and to sit with that question of what God might long for me. So, your mission, if you choose to accept it. I wonder what it would be like if we had a sip of silence together tonight. If you're uncomfortable with that, you can send Anna an awful email about this terrible southerner that came and brought all kinds of weird ideas. But maybe we could just do that now for a minute. If you put the next slide up, that would be great. Just follow some of these steps if you're happy to. You don't have to, but maybe just take a minute to become comfortable. If you're happy to put the soles of your feet on the ground. And just, you might be happy to do this, but maybe just take a moment to pause, still ourselves and close our eyes. Again, you don't have to, but if you'd like to, please. And just become mindful of your breath, slowly and deeply.